Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our first Research Tuesday event of 2023, Healthcare Overhaul. I'd like to start by acknowledging that we are meeting on the traditional lands of the Kaurna people, the original custodians of the Adelaide Plains, and the lands on which the University of Adelaide here on North Terrace, at Wake and at Roseworthy are all located. My name is Hayley Parkinson, and I am undertaking my PhD in the School of Biomedicine here at the University of Adelaide. And my research area is in multiple myeloma, which is a type of blood cancer. I'm going to be your MC for tonight. Tonight's presentation will address how much consideration the patient voice is given in decision-making in healthcare. We'll be spotlighting two practices making a difference: data registries and patient-reported outcome questionnaires, or PROs for short. According to cardiology researchers, cardiovascular registries are adding much-needed evidence to the spectrum, and PROs are empowering people with heart disease to tell their stories, be heard, and experience better healthcare. With more reliable, ethical, and cost-effective healthcare in research, we need to encourage wider use of these tools and conduct further research to measure their impact on care. During tonight's event, you'll hear from Professor John Spertus, a renowned cardiologist and recognised as one of the most influential scientific minds, and Professor Frederick Masudi, Chief Science Officer and Vice President of the Clinical Research Analytics at Accession, one of the largest private healthcare systems in the United States. Following the presentations from John and Fred, you'll have an opportunity to ask questions. We'll be taking questions both from the audience who are here tonight, as well as those who are listening at home. We encourage those of you listening at home to please submit questions via the Q&A panel, which you should see at the bottom of your screen. So now let's get underway. I would first like to introduce you to our first speaker, Professor Frederick Masudi. Please join me in welcoming Fred to the stage.
Thank you, Hayley, and thank you all for being here tonight, whether you're here in person or listening online. It's really an honor to be here. Just so happy to be seeing old friends, Professor Beltrami, Professor Zietz, Rosanna, who we've worked with for quite some time, and then to meet new friends, including Linda and the rest of the team who have been so kind and generous and hospitable to us. And this is my first trip to Australia. So, as Hayley said, first, again, to acknowledge the Indigenous people. I think a very important issue to acknowledge here. We certainly have many of the same issues in the United States. I'm going to talk tonight about clinical registries to optimize healthcare performance. These are my disclosures. So cardiology, and I'm a cardiologist, Dr. Spertus is a cardiologist, but cardiology has witnessed some of the most amazing developments in the last several decades. The development of coronary stents that have transformed the approach to coronary revascularization, or cardiac imaging, now able to get MRIs that provide exquisite detail, exquisite diagnostic information about individuals with heart disease. Or in mechanical circulatory support, the development of left ventricular assist devices that keep people who would once certainly die because of end-stage heart failure alive for years and years. Or, for example, some of the developments in electrophysiology, where mapping systems allow very precise ablation of cardiac arrhythmias that in the past could either not be treated or treated through an operation. So these have been tremendous advancements in cardiology. From my perspective as a health services researcher, this is not the biggest story in cardiology over the last 50 years. The biggest story is the lost potential of translating the science and evidence into care and optimizing the patient experience, as the Institute of Medicine has pointed out here in their diagram about learning healthcare systems, where the perspective is we lose so much potential at every step of the way, where you do the science, the evidence, you develop treatment guidelines, and everything is well positioned, and care is suboptimal despite that. This is what I call the final mile. So making that transition from the science and the evidence into clinical care and translating it into optimal patient experiences. This, I think, is the biggest story over the last 50 years. I'm going to start with a little bit of history for quality, and it'll be history from the United States, but I'm sure that there are similarities elsewhere. with the story of Ernest Amory Codman, who was a Boston surgeon, and he was sufficiently disgusted with the lack of outcomes evaluation at none other than the Massachusetts General Hospital that he resigned to start his End Results Hospital, where he admitted his errors in public, and he encouraged his colleagues to do the same. And their response was that to this end result message was an uproar, and he was ostracized, and his income plummeted, and he was ordered to step down as the chair of the Surgical Society. But he never stopped in his effort to measure, report, and improve. As you can see, in this case, he's referred to as a martyr of healthcare quality. And so how did physicians react to this, at least in the United States? It may have been different here because it seems like you were all so much more amiable. But physicians responded with anger, or also denial. Like, this is not my problem, this is someone else's problem, right? And as Mark Twain, American humorist, said, nothing so needs reforming as other people's habits. And this was the perspective, that it was an issue of bad apples. Most everyone was doing a very good job, but certainly there were a few, and it was always someone else in another hospital far, far away that was having this problem. Not at my hospital, not in my practice, is quality a problem. But there was a revolution in understanding what the issues in quality were that developed over the next several decades. One of the most important projects that came out of the 1990s was the Cooperative Cardiovascular Project, which was funded by what was called then the Healthcare Financing Administration, now called the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, but the insurance company for the elderly and disabled in the United States. They funded research to say, how well are we doing in terms of the basic care of patients with heart attacks? So at the time these studies were done, the evidence was well established. The guidelines had enshrined that evidence that we should be using aspirin and beta blockers and delivering other therapies to patients with heart attacks. And they had been available for decades at this point. This evidence had been available for quite some time. And they assessed the quality of care for heart attack in every of the 50 states in the United States. And what they found was quite interesting. First of all, there was marked variation in the rates of use of these evidence-based therapies. In this case, this is for beta blockers. But this example was relevant to just about every therapy they looked at. What they found was that, first of all, at the state level, quality varied substantially. In some states, those in the light yellow, and I put that legend over there on the right so it's easier to see, in some of the states, 30 to 38% of people who were ideal candidates for these therapies that would save lives were getting them, only a third. And you might say, well, there was some good news too, because there were some other states where it was much higher. But even if you look at the states labeled in red, rates range from 68 to 77%, which meant even at best, only 3 in 4 were getting the right therapy, which meant 1 in every 4 patients was not getting this therapy that was known to save lives. This is not consistent with that story of bad apples, right? This is a story of an endemic problem. And the Institute of Medicine in 2001 published a very important treatise called Crossing the Quality Chasm. And that's what that prior slide represents. It's a chasm. It's not a little crack that we need to patch over. It's an enormous gap that needed to be fixed and continues to need to be fixed. So in the late 1990s, the American College of Cardiology formed our first national cardiac registry, the STS, Society of Thoracic Surgeons. It also developed registries. But this registry was developed at a time when cardiologists were entirely being paid in a fee-for-service fashion. That is to say, you produce more widgets, you get more money. It doesn't matter whether or not you do it well or you do it poorly. If you do more, you get paid more. So rather than just advocating for higher salaries for cardiologists, which many professional societies might do, the American College of Cardiology decided to invest in quality and to lead on quality, recognizing the data from the Cooperative Cardiovascular Project and others that had demonstrated that this was an endemic problem. So they invested in this registry, the cath-PCI registry, the first one of their programs, to better understand the quality of care for patients who were getting either an angiogram or a percutaneous coronary intervention, which is PCI, so opening a coronary artery, in cath labs across the United States. And I'll take a step back and let you know how I conceptualize registries, how the American College of Cardiology, or the ACC, conceptualizes registries, because it's a word that's used in very different ways across medicine. Some consider it an observational cohort, where we're going to collect data on a group of patients over a period of a year and look at outcomes in that population. That sort of science is important and useful, but that's not what a registry is in my mind. A registry is an ongoing, perpetual, really, program to assess quality of care using standard data elements and definitions that are compiled into a clinical database, that is to say very detailed clinical data, not just data from billing, from insurance companies, which generally is not that relevant to the clinical situation, and using that clinical data to translate it into actionable information, which supports quality assessment, which in turn supports quality improvement, and also supports clinical research, with the objective of playing a meaningful role in clinical practice and health policy. So this, in my mind, is what a registry is. In the mind of the American College of Cardiology, the American Heart Association, the STS, our colleagues with CADOSA, this is what a registry is all about. And this shows you the growth because I've worked most closely with the American College of Cardiology of the ACC programs. Starting with the cath-PCI, swimming upstream in a fee-for-service environment, the ACC now operates 10 different programs that are used in 2,200 acute care hospitals, that are used in numerous practices, have engaged 15,000 cardiovascular specialists, and most importantly, have touched the lives of more than 100 million individuals with heart disease. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the ways that registry data are employed. And again, the data is not the end, it is the means of generating the information that you need to improve the quality of care of the patients you serve. So what happens is the hospital collects data, again, detailed clinical data, and translate that into actionable information, performance indicators that say, how often are you giving that patient with a heart attack aspirin, a statin drug to lower cholesterol and reduce the risk of subsequent events, beta blockers, et cetera. So it's taking that information, providing hospitals with this information. This is an example of a dashboard from the University of Colorado that we use to help direct our quality improvement activities. And we can look at that and we can say, where do we need to focus? Where do we need to work to improve quality of care? It's also used at a health system level. So I now work at a very large health system. It's about 140 hospitals, many of which perform PCIs. And at our service line meetings, when we have a cardiology service line meeting, registry data are presented, and we can provide this information to each of our sites and provide them, in some cases, with the tools to make a change. This is an example of same-day discharge after elective percutaneous interventions. So situations not an acute heart attack, someone getting a percutaneous coronary intervention to open an obstructed coronary artery. And we can say, how often are these people discharged on the same day? Which is something that's very appealing to the patient. It's also appealing to the health system, the insurer, and everyone involved. Everyone wins. And as you can see, fairly substantial variation in the extent to which individuals are discharged on the same day. We can have an aspirational target, which in this case is 15%, not that ambitious yet. But we can then, as a health system, work together to improve care and outcomes. Registry data have been used in support of national quality improvement programs in the United States. So we talk about getting arteries open in acute heart attacks. We do that in the cath lab now. We, the royal we, I don't do them. But one takes a patient to the cath lab when they're having an acute heart attack, they open the artery, and that improves outcomes. In the United States for years, again, despite knowing that this was the thing to do, about 70% of people were getting this therapy, and it was a stubborn number. It just did not move. Harlan Krumholtz and his colleagues at Yale developed a program to focus on improving this particular measure, and was wildly successful. Now, as I said earlier, at our hospital and many others, the failure to provide timely care is now almost a reportable event, even once or twice a year, compared with 3 out of every 10. Registries have also contributed to improving patient safety. One of the first publications that came out of the cath PCI registry was a study around different approaches to closing an arterial puncture site after a procedure. There are various ways to do it. Back in the day when I was a fellow, it meant manual compression, standing there 20, 30 minutes and then hoping for the best. Then devices emerged to provide this function. In this study, again, one of the first from the registry, you can see that manual compression, which is that far left bar, the dark blue, then you see a variety of different devices. And one of those is not like the others, right? Well, that particular device was identified as one that was associated with much higher complication rates. And as a result of this data, those devices were removed from the market. Thankfully, from the patient's perspective, right? This is another example. It's a bit complex, but this is real-time evaluation of device safety. It was run by Fred Resnick at Leahy Clinic in Massachusetts, where you can see on this axis, this is time, and this is a cumulative incidence of events and the number of patients, which is this line. And what you can see is this is the blue is the cumulative incidence of events for all closure devices. These dots are those for a particular device. And as you can see early on, the rates with this particular device were indistinguishable statistically from the overall rate. But as you can see, not that far into this assessment, within 3/4, it became clear that this device was substantially associated with substantially more complications than the average device. And again, this had implications for the use of this device in practice. So this is a way that registries can be used to enhance patient safety. Registries are also used to assess the appropriateness of procedures. So in the case of percutaneous interventions, they should be used, of course, for acute heart attacks, but also in patients who have symptoms outside of the context of a heart attack, patients who have symptoms despite the use of maximal medical therapy and who have evidence of ischemia, so evidence of poor circulation to the heart on some sort of objective study. And the NCDR began to feed back appropriateness information to sites. They would say, when you perform PCIs, this proportion of them are appropriate, this proportion of them are of uncertain appropriateness, and there's some that are inappropriate. And as you can see here, beginning in 2009, around the time these criteria were implemented, and much credit to Dr. Spurtis for this having happened at all. He and his group at UMKC were fundamental to the success of this program. You can see that starting out in 2009, about less than 45% of cases were uncertain, about 30% were considered appropriate, and about 25% were inappropriate. Then over several years of reporting, you can see that the proportion of inappropriate cases went down, appropriate cases went up, and the uncertain went down as well. So helping support patients by reporting the appropriateness of procedures and seeing that more procedures would be done for the right patient at the right time. And if you look at the hospital level, you can see that the number of inappropriate cases declined consistent with this. This is now at the hospital level. And the variation at the hospital level also declined. Much tighter clustering, smaller numbers of inappropriate cases. So at both the patient level and the hospital level, there was demonstrable improvement over time. Obviously still work to do, but substantial improvement. And this is what's being done here in Adelaide by my colleagues who have been developing the CADOSA program, which has been harmonized with the ACC registries, both the Cath PCI registry and the coronary artery disease registry, using the same data that we use, which facilitates comparisons. And colleagues here have done more than what we've done with many of the registries in the United States, that they're adding other features and considering other things. One of which is the measurement of patient-reported outcomes, which is something that Dr. Spertus is going to speak more about in just a moment. So, kudos to the team here for the work that they've been doing to advance quality and understand the impact of the care that we deliver, or that you deliver, on outcomes of patients, including how a patient feels, which is about the most important thing. So I'd summarize by saying gaps in quality of care are a pervasive feature of medical practice. Using standardized clinical data, registries generate insights to understand patient care and outcomes. Registries are fundamental to quality improvement in many domains of quality, be it safety, efficacy, timeliness, efficiency, equity. And CADOSA is designed to improve cardiovascular care and outcomes in South Australia. And I won't take questions now. I'll hand it off to Dr. Spertus, who I've known now for 20 years, a dear friend of mine, despite his many quirks. Dr. Spertus was introduced as an exceptional pioneer, and that, I think, really understates the impact that John has had on cardiology by developing metrics of patient health status. I don't know that I admire any of my professional colleagues more than I admire John, which is actually saying a lot. And so I'm looking forward, John, to hearing what you have to say about patient-reported outcomes. Yeah, no, he's very embarrassed. He's a bit uncomfortable now. So, John, please.
Thanks so much. There's always something challenging when you get health services researchers, people who are really studying the healthcare system and its outcomes, because, especially speaking to, a lot of the public here, you take as blind faith that, I'm getting the very best care, my doctor's the very best, and yet, we continue to try and strive to do better, and we're not trying to instill fear into you, but to suggest that there's a movement to realize that we're never good enough. We can keep getting better and better. And Fred's done a remarkable amount. He's now obviously running a very, very large healthcare systems approach to research and quality in the United States, but for the last 15 years had been the guiding light of the American College of Cardiology, and it's just been a tremendous force for creating the infrastructure to try and deliver better care. I've taken a different approach, which is trying to figure out how to measure and quantify what we had ignored, because without measurement, you can't understand how you're doing or improving. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the work that I've been doing in this regard. These are my disclosures. I'm not sure they're necessarily that relevant here, although as Fred alluded to, I've spent most of my career trying to figure out a way to capture the patient's voice as a means for improving care, and that's what I'm going to be talking about. I have another disclosure that I'm obligated. So being from Kansas City and coming out here, I have to acknowledge that my team won the Super Bowl, and I would much rather, and I think you would probably rather hear about that, but then again, it was yesterday, and that's old news, and I guess should have been expected, but very, very exciting for us in humble Kansas City. So just imagine a brand new revolutionary test, some new test that could actually define the status of a medical condition with great precision, that it could improve the accuracy and it could also improve the efficiency of delivering care to those who most benefited. Imagine that test could risk stratify prognosis, figure out who is going to do well and who was not, so that we could put more emphasis into helping those who were at greatest risk and needed more help to optimize their prognosis. Imagine this test could figure out who's going to benefit from a treatment and how can we use that information to engage people in choosing a therapy aligned with their own goals and values. A tool that can monitor with exquisite sensitivity patients' response to treatment. that could support population health management and that could actually define the quality of healthcare. And as a sort of a Star Trek geek, it sounds like I'm talking about the tricorder. But in reality, I'm talking about patient-reported outcomes. And, when we treat somebody, and I'm going to use coronary artery disease, that's the #1 cause of death for men and women in the industrialized world, there are really two goals. We want to prevent further progression of the disease, the development of future heart attacks, of heart failure, of death. But we also want to make patients feel better. We want to improve their symptoms, their function, and their quality of life. And in fact, from many patients' perspective, this is even a more relevant outcome. It's something they care about and that they want to get treated. In fact, my mom, who just passed away last year, used to ask me, what do you do? And I said, well, Mom, I'm really interested in understanding how our treatments make patients feel, and do they feel better, and does it help with their symptoms and all of that? And she says, what have doctors been doing all along? I mean, she couldn't fathom that I could get paid to do something so basic and so simple. And, there is a conceptual model that we as scientists and as clinicians have really embraced, which is trying to understand the underlying pathophysiology of a disease by believing that if we understood that, we would be in a much better position to treat and improve care and outcomes. And so much of our focus was on how tight is the coronary artery. Professor Beltrami's done tremendous work trying to understand vascular function, that people could have lots of chest pain and be very debilitated, not because of blockages in their arteries, but because the way the microvasculature works or spasms. But from patients' perspective, some of you may have coronary blockages and nobody knows, is it 10% blocked? Is it 60% blocked? It's completely opaque to us. What we're aware of are the symptoms of chest pain that we get. We're aware of how that angina or that chest pain impairs our ability to do physical activity, to engage in social activities. And because we might have symptoms and physical limitations due to those symptoms, it can impair our quality of life. And to me, measuring each of these components is important because two identical people, a 42-year-old female construction worker and a 74-year-old widower, might both have the exact same amount of angina occurring twice a week. They might both be limited in climbing a second flight of stairs because of some chest pain. But the young woman who can't work a full day in her job and has difficulty, supporting her family might have a terrible quality of life because none of her 42-year-old peers have chest pain or have physical limitations due to that. Whereas a 74-year-old widower is doing so much better than a lot of his colleagues, his quality of life might be excellent. And so measuring each of these distinctly seems to me to be very, very important. And so that's what we talk about, the range of health status, the ways in which the disease manifests itself to patients. So, my early career was trying to develop this for coronary artery disease because at that time we were studying the outcomes of clinical trials by, looking at rates of heart attack, the rates of death, maybe exercise on a treadmill test, but never the symptoms, function, and quality of life of patients. And so we created a questionnaire. It was originally 19 items. We've reduced it to 7 to ask the kinds of things that a doctor spending a lot of time taking care of you would ask, which it would basically be, how limited are you due to your chest pain, or what's your physical limitation? How often are you having chest pain? Are you satisfied with the current treatment? And how is it impacting your quality of life? We sort of moved the score, spread the scores from 0 to 100, where higher scores are better. And there's been a lot of scientific work to establish the rigor and hardness of this data, because when I got into this field, because these data came from patients and not a machine, nobody believed them. And, people sort of will scoff and snicker, but that was the bias, that this was soft, squishy data, and yet it's much more strongly associated with prognosis and, costs than many other things that we devote a lot more energy and expense trying to quantify. And it sounds very sort of vague and esoteric. I want to make this very concrete for you. I mean, this is the 7-item version of the Seattle Angina Questionnaire, and it basically just asks, how limited are you from extremely to not at all limited in doing routine activities like walking on indoors on level ground, gardening or vacuuming, or lifting or moving heavy objects? But what's great about it is it asks these questions the exact same way every single time. It asks, how often do you have chest pain or angina or have to take nitroglycerin for it? And how does it impact your quality of life? And the ability to reproducibly get this from the patient every single time, as opposed to when I go to clinic on a Monday morning when I was not on call and I'm bright and eager and I've had my coffee and I can really take time and talk to the patients, versus Thursday afternoon when I'm way behind on schedule. I've got lots of charts to fill out. I'm not going to get home till 10 o'clock at night. I'm not going to take as good a history. This takes it the exact same way every single time. And it maps directly to each of those concepts that I talked about so that you can interpret what different scores mean. Now, if Fred had not talked so long, I would be able to go through all of the ways in which the PROs could actually help clinical care. But I just want to highlight 2 examples because I think it's really illustrative. And the first is to sort of recognize that when I was in medical school, I went to the University of California, San Francisco, and we would round at the VA. And at the VA, there were a lot of veterans who had rheumatic heart disease, very complex cardiac anatomy and physiology. And, you know, the medical students would spend forever listening to patients. They were incredibly patient, and they would let us listen to them and percuss the heart and feel where the heart's maximum impulse was. And then the doctor with the grayest hair would come in and put his stethoscope on, because they were always men, put his stethoscope on the patient, percuss out the heart, and then he would just declare exactly what was going on. You know, this patient has aortic insufficiency with a little Austin Flint murmur, and there's obviously a dilated cardiomyopathy because the lateral walls. And we would all listen to him and go, oh, that's exactly right. Well, it turns out there might be different people with different amounts of gray hair, and it led to limitations in the accuracy and reproducibility of assessing the anatomy and physiology of the heart. And along came the echocardiogram, which was an ultrasound picture that defined with exquisite accuracy exactly how big the heart was, how the valves worked, etc. And it created it was an evolution in understanding the anatomy and physiology of the heart. Well, who tells us how much patients are limited and how much angina they have? Well, it's the doctor taking the history, right? And that too leads to lots of variability and difficulties in accuracy and reproducibility. I think it's going to evolve to these patient-reported outcome measures. So, the most sort of, the sincerest form of flattery is obviously replication. And Professor Beltrami and I first met over a study that he did in 2003, I believe, where he went and surveyed 210 practices of primary care physicians throughout Australia to look at the accuracy with which doctors were assessing patients' chest pain or their angina. And, because it was in Australia, it was GPs, we said, well, that doesn't have much relevance, so we'll repeat this 15 years later in the United States in cardiology practices. And so what we did is we identified 25 cardiology practices. So these are practices where patients are coming specifically to get an assessment and treatment for their cardiac disease. And we basically had realized there's a patient and a physician. The patient is telling the doctor how much chest pain they have. So we asked the patient to complete the Seattle Angina Questionnaire. The doctor is hearing the patient, and so they're making their own assessment. And by the way, this used to be the gold standard for measuring symptoms and function in cardiac disease. And so we asked the doctor, does this patient have daily, weekly, monthly, or no angina? And we looked at the concordance. And I was, I've been, I don't want to throw doctors under the bus. I mean, there clearly are times, the very first patient that had, that I know of, we had a heart failure questionnaire, and the first person to use it in clinical practice was a guy named Charlie Porter in Kansas City, and he would give it, and this was, in 1999, 2000, and they were on Scantrons, and so you fill in the little bubbles, and the worse they were, the more their bubbles would be shifted to the left. So he couldn't score it because there was no electronic medical record, but he would glance at the card before he walked into the patient, and he would see that this patient had a shift to the left. And so he sees a patient who comes in with a shift to the left, and it's a lovely 68-year-old woman, and he says, "Mrs. Jones, how are you doing?" And she goes, "Oh, I'm doing great, Dr. Porter." "Oh, really?" Any shortness of breath? "Oh, no, Dr. Porter." "Any difficulty climbing stairs?" "Not at all." He says, "Well, Ms. Jones, you filled out this questionnaire before you came in, and it says you actually have a lot of shortness of breath." He goes, "Well, yeah, I guess that's true." "And then it's hard to go up a flight of stairs." She goes, "Yeah, I have to stop halfway." "Well, why did you tell me you were doing so well?" "Oh, you are such a good doctor, Dr. Porter. I did not want you to feel bad." I mean, this stuff happens. So I just want to say, when I show you these next data, that it isn't that the doctors are necessarily all terrible, the patients can be terrible too. So in this cohort of patients, and they're all seen by cardiologists, 2/3 had no angina, 1/4 had monthly angina, but 8% had daily or weekly angina, a lot of angina. And when the doctors were asked to say, does this patient have daily, weekly, monthly, or no angina, about 2/3 of the time they got it right. But in 1 out of 4 patients, the doctor, even though the patient said, "I'm having daily or weekly angina," the doctor said they had no angina. Well, that's a shocking difference, right? Because you would treat a patient with a lot of angina differently than one with no angina. And we thought, okay, they're under-recognizing women. They're under-recognizing old people. They're under-recognizing minorities. I mean, we thought there'd be a lot of sort of internal inherent bias that would be influencing the ability to accurately recognize angina. And what we found was actually none of those things made a difference. There's no association, except that if you had 2 identical patients seeing 2 random doctors in our study, you were 2.5-fold more likely to be under-recognized by one of those doctors than another on average. And when we looked at the individual doctors who saw more than 15 patients in our study, there is one doctor here who never under-recognized their patient's angina, and another doctor here who under-recognized 85% of their patient's angina. Now, again, we know this. I mean, some doctors do a good job taking a history, some don't. Whatever it is, that variation's astonishing. And, because it's so important to accurately understand patients' angina to recommend additional therapy, with additional anti-anginal medications, whether it's doing another diagnostic test to confirm it, whether it's doing angioplasty or bypass surgery, we found that those patients who were under-recognized were 90% less likely to have some new approach to treat their angina, which is exactly what you expect, because the doctor didn't even know that they were very symptomatic. So to me, there's a lot of value in starting to integrate these kinds of questionnaires in routine clinical practice. The next sort of step is, can we start to use these data to help patients choose therapy? And there was a very famous trial that finished a few years ago that took the highest risk patients. So these are patients who, when they go on a stress test, a whole bunch of their heart muscle is not getting enough blood flow. And we said, well, today, every one of those patients, well, not today, but before this study was done, every one of those patients would have been referred to the cardiac catheterization laboratory so we could define the blockages in their arteries and recommend angioplasty or bypass surgery to improve blood flow. And so we randomized patients to go to the cath lab, get whatever they needed, angioplasty or bypass surgery, and optimal medical therapy, or to not go to the cath lab and just get optimal medical therapy, diet, exercise, things like that. And we looked at their outcomes. How were their clinical events and how was their quality of life over time? And so when we looked at clinical events, did going to the cath lab, which we all expected it would, prevent death, heart attack, heart failure, unstable angina, or resuscitated cardiac arrest, there was absolutely no difference in clinical events going to the cath lab or not. There was, however, an improvement in their quality of life. And so patients on average benefited more if they went to the cath lab and got whatever treatment they needed from that. And so in light of this, there was an update to the guidelines about a year ago where one of the top points was in patients being considered for coronary revascularization, treatment decisions should be patient-centered. They should incorporate patients' preferences so you have their goals and values, and there should be shared decision-making. And so, what is shared decision-making? Well, shared decision-making is the patient saying to the doctor, these are my priorities. This is, I want to live longer. I want to have better quality of life. Whatever I do or don't want to undergo the risk of bypass surgery, whatever their preferences are, the doctor hears those preferences. With their medical knowledge and their understanding of the evidence, they together make a shared decision. But the challenge is that the patients do care a lot about their symptoms, function, and quality of life, and clinicians have no idea how to tell an individual patient how one treatment or another is going to affect their symptoms, function, or quality of life. So we decided to build models based on patients' angina to start with, their diabetes, their age, their gender, et cetera, and to look at the outcomes that were in the ischemia trial. But what outcomes should we be looking at? So we actually engaged patients and did a bunch of focus groups where we asked them, what's most important to you? And it turned out the two most important things by far were quality of life and survival, longevity, followed by physical function, followed by angina. And a lot of things that we as clinicians thought were most important, like preventing heart attacks, were actually much less important to the patients compared to these. And they said things like, forget longevity, it's the quality of life today that matters to me. Or a patient said, I don't want to die, I want to live and see my grandchildren get older, I want to see my daughter live her life. This is somebody really emphasizing the importance of longevity. Somebody emphasized the importance of physical function, said the feeling of being able to walk 45 minutes again and I feel stronger as I'm walking, that's a joy that you take for granted until it's almost taken away from you. And for symptoms, somebody said, I've never had another chest pain again, nor do I ever hope to get another chest pain. These are what patients care about. And so we worked with the patients, how can we represent those outcomes? And we did a bunch of different graphical ways of trying to describe this. And then we sort of worked with serial patients as well as providers to optimize the presentation of this kind of information, all driven by individual risk models. Then we brought the final patients from the first group back to say, you told us what you wanted, this is what we built, is this what you want, before we created a final tool. And the way this works is that every patient will get a different tool because it depends on these kinds of factors, their age, their gender, whether or not they have diabetes, et cetera. And you fill out the baseline Seattle Angina questionnaire so that their burden of angina is incorporated into these forms. And the tool looks something like this. It's a one-page form. So it's about how do we engage the patients in deciding what they want. And so there's a brief description about what is coronary artery disease. There's a brief description about what are the ways it can be treated so people understand they can go to the cath lab, get angioplasty or bypass surgery or just medical therapy. And then we show them that, today your quality of life is, fair to good at a score of 50. A year from now, it'll be here with medicines alone. It's likely to be here with going to the cath lab and getting bypass surgery or angioplasty. And we do that for quality of life, physical function, chest pain or angina, and survival. And it never is different for survival because this treatment doesn't affect survival. But the idea is, can we create the infrastructure so patients can understand the consequences of the treatment they're making so that they can choose what they want as recommended by the guidelines? And this is going to be free, on the web for doctors and patients to use, hopefully in the next few months. So I'm going to end here by really saying that I think that hearing the patient's voice is absolutely critical. We just need to listen.
Thanks so much, John and Fred. That was really fantastic. As someone who works in medical research, it's always really nice to see what things are happening in the clinical setting and how these are being used with new drug treatments and treatment advances, and how this is coming together to really overall improve patient outcomes. That was really fantastic for me to hear, and I think everyone here found that really fantastic as well. So now we're going to open up to the floor for some questions. I think some people, you can still submit your questions online if you would like. But while everyone's warming up, I'll go to a pre-submitted question, which was from Janet. And Janet asked, do you see these processes, PROs and data registries, also being applied in the aged care setting? So this question is to either of you.
In what setting?
The aged care setting. So I guess nursing homes and that kind of
setting.
In
geriatric.
Oh.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, a number of our registry programs, include a very large number of older persons by virtue of the epidemiology of the disease. I think, though, there are opportunities for these sorts of things in various areas of medicine, not just in cardiology. I use these as examples. There are orthopedic registries. There are registries in cancer, and potentially for geriatric medicine as well. And certainly, issues around quality of life and physical function are particularly important to this population. So I think they're highly relevant to the older population.
No, I think that's right. I mean, I think that one of the challenges, and maybe this is a generational thing. When Fred and I are, 80 and 90, we will sort of demand more input, but a lot of our, the World War II generation, is very deferential to the physician and often may have goals and values that differ from what the physician thinks is important. So that tool that I sort of described, I mean, should an 85-year-old who actually has very good quality of life and very few symptoms, even if they have a very bad series of obstructions in the coronary arteries, undergo bypass surgery? By creating these kinds of tools, it empowers people to understand what they're deciding. The explosion in treating valvular heart disease, which, aortic stenosis, is really largely a disease of the elderly. I mean, the randomized trials, I think the average age was 82 or something in the first trials. So I think it's going to become increasingly important in these kinds of populations where I don't think we should presume that what might apply to a 45-year-old should necessarily apply to an 80-year-old. And yet we have to give the 80-year-old the understanding of what the consequences of their decision are so that their goals, values, and risk tolerance can be incorporated in deciding what's best for them.
And I think it can be hazardous, just to elaborate a little bit, to make assumptions about quality of life in the older population from data that, from your study, Dr. Spertus, that we collaborated on, the KCCQ validation study, where we found that younger patients with a certain amount of functional limitation had substantially lower quality of life than older individuals with the same amount of functional limitation. And so us sitting there and projecting our values on a patient, saying, well, I wouldn't want to be in a position where I can't climb a flight of stairs. Well, no one does. But if my expectations are that that's about where I'm going to be, my quality of life might be very, very good. And so making assumptions about this is, I think, quite hazardous. And this is where having an objective measure that's valid, reliable, reproducible, sensitive to clinical change is so important, and particularly in the older population.
Just one other thing, Dr. Masudi talked a lot about decreasing variability in beta blocker use after a heart attack or something like that. And a very highly reliable, good quality system has very little variability. This is sort of the Deming model and how cars are made in Toyota and et cetera, et cetera. But when that variability is not due to the doctors providing care, but is due to a reflection of the patient's preferences, then that's the kind of variability you want, because that's delivering person-centered care. And that's, the real goal. And it's just trying to make sure that it's reflecting the patient's preferences and not the doctor's bias or a failure in the system's organization that I think is so important. And I know it's sort of a technical point, but I think it's an important one related to your question.
I think we've gone a bit far afield from the question, but that's fine.
Yeah, that was fantastic. That was really great.
We're just filling time because nobody else has a question.
Exactly.
So.
I think we do have one here at the front.
I think it's fantastic that you're including the patient's voice, and I like that one-page survey that you had. My question is to do with social determinants of health. So America's, much like Australia, it's multicultural, and people all come from different types of backgrounds. So how do you accommodate people that may not be able to do that exactly how you've got it? Have you got different ways of presenting that information and acquiring the patient's voice?
So, the question is around sort of having these kinds of tools broadly understood and applicable to people of many different backgrounds, and also touched on the concept of social determinants of health being a very strong influencer of outcomes. And both are absolutely true. So we were very intentional in our patient recruitment into those focus groups. They were conducted in Kansas City and in New York City. We had, entirely Hispanic, Spanish-speaking focus group, as well as a very enriched cohort of African Americans, and intentionally split with men and women, and tried to get a very broad age spectrum. But that said, it's not perfect. I mean, there are going to be limitations, and we would like. Right now, this concept doesn't exist in routine medical care. You don't see the big clinical trials even trying to incorporate the patient's voice and presenting tools based on those trials to help support patients leveraging the evidence to make better decisions. So, it's a baby step. We're going to have to get better. There's probably going to be other ways of sort of integrating videos and sign language and other strategies, having people explain and describe this from that look like the patient's making the decision. So in Colorado, where Fred's from, they have created these kinds of tools, not based off data from clinical trials, but sort of the summaries of data from multiple trials with, videos that can be done by very diverse patients and providers explaining this. And so, it's a very important work to try and figure that out. The other sort of hidden question is sometimes the risk factors for bad outcomes are not just one individual patient's physiology or age or gender, but the environment in which they live. And, we need to get there more than we are now. We don't have, so I tend to be a skeptic about big data and artificial intelligence. One of the ways where I think it could be really, really beneficial is by integrating factors that are distinct from the patient, like their social deprivation index in the community in which they live and things of that sort. And, I would like to see us get there. I think it will just take a while to figure out, how to sort of capture that as a unique risk factor in a reproducible way, and then to integrate it with these other factors. As tools like PROs get more widely used and incorporated into the registries that Fred described, we will eventually have the data available to build and tailor those models to those social determinants of health. But I just think we're not there yet. I don't know if you
I would say from the perspective of registries, first of all, a very important question. These issues of income, education, access to care are so important to health. The challenge from the registry perspective is it's very difficult to collect those at scale, because unlike some of the clinical variables we'll find in the health record, social determinants of health are not consistently documented. There really are not even, in many cases, accepted definitions for this. I'm working on a document with the American College of Cardiology and American Heart Association to standardize some of the definitions. Now that doesn't get us to having those data available for us when we abstract the data. That having been said, there are measures of social determinants of health. They're on the geographic level, be it by mail code in the United States or what's called census tract by the US Census, where you can attribute social determinants at least on that geographic level. It's not on an individual level, so it's a bit of a surrogate, which is better than nothing, but not as good as knowing this on the individual scale. In fact, my health system, Ascension, made a substantial investment in the collection of social determinants of health. We've collected now SDOH data on more than 2 million surveys from individuals within our health system, and we're using that to help direct patients with specific needs to resources, but also to better understand this connection between these social determinants of health and the quality of care we deliver and the outcomes that patients experience.
We have a couple more questions. If you just keep your hand up, we'll have a mic come to you. There's one at the back and then one down the front just after.
Thanks. With registries, one wants as complete a data set as possible. I just wonder about the practicalities. How do you manage consent?
Right, so the registries themselves are for the purposes of quality improvement, and so so consent is not obtained. From the perspective of research, the research that is done is considered minimal risk to individuals, acknowledging that there's never no risk. And so for research of the data that are collected for the registries for the purposes of quality improvement, those are performed with a waiver of consent from the Institutional Review Board. Yep. Certainly other uses of the registry, for example, a registry-embedded clinical trial or interventions involving the registry, those then do require consent.
Okay, thanks. It would be viewed similarly in Australia.
Yeah.
And a question about the patient-reported outcomes in drug development, their place in drug development. In clinical trials with commercial sponsors, the primary outcome measures are major adverse cardiovascular events, invariably. PROs might be fifth in the secondary outcome measure. You know, they don't get much of a look in. Why is that? And is their usefulness not all that great in a clinical trial setting, which is quite an artificial setting, and whereas you're looking in the field and clinical trials. So I'm just wondering about the validity and usefulness of PROs right up front in drug development, whether there's a place for them.
So it's a great question, and I'm so happy to be answering it now than 10 years ago. So there has been now I can really only speak for the FDA, but the FDA is the entity that approves and allows drugs to be sold in the US. And because we spend 5 to 75 times more per drug than anywhere else in the world, drug companies care a lot about the FDA and their approval. And they have really had a transformation in their view to support more patient-centered outcomes. And in the device side, they were ahead of the drug side, but both of them have now qualified a questionnaire I didn't talk about here, but the Kansas City Cardiomyopathy Questionnaire as they've qualified it as a clinical outcome assessment, meaning that if a drug or a device improves scores on that questionnaire, even in the absence of data that it alters, death or hospitalization, that can still be a basis for approval. And that's a huge shift from a decade ago. I will say that, the battle scars I have from getting them to qualify this were amazing. I mean, for the device side, it went fairly quickly. It took 2.5 years. For the drug side, I took 5 years and 5,000 pages of documentation for them to qualify the KCCQ. But they've done it now, and so an enormous number of new trials are being designed for the KCCQ as the primary outcome. And it's still in its infancy, but especially for there's a disease called hypertrophic obstructive cardiomyopathy where the heart squeezes so vigorously that blood can't get out of the blood chamber, and there just aren't that many people with it. And so they got approval for a new drug based on 200 patients, and I think the primary reason it got approved was because it had such a big impact on the quality of life measure. And so they are approving more and more drugs for that. And I think we're going to see that really go faster and faster, because for a device or a pharma company to do a trial, the quality of life outcomes, because death might occur in 2% or 5% or 8% of patients. You might need 5,000 patients to do a definitive trial with mortality as the outcome. Quality of life is assessed in everybody. And so sometimes just a few hundred patients can be done to have adequate power to show the benefit. And I think we're going to see more and more new treatments leading with patient-reported outcomes as a primary outcome.
I would say, to address part of your question as well, this issue of internal versus external validity. So the internal validity of a trial being, how are these results true in the population that was studied? And oftentimes clinical trials don't enroll the typical patient, right? There are a number of exclusion criteria, and in fact, a lot of social determinants of health probably play a role as well. So less diverse populations that are healthier in other respects than those that we see in clinical care. I think that that's indifferent to outcome. That is to say, the external validity of problem applies to mortality, to rehospitalization, and to health status equally. The one benefit of the registries is to be able to corroborate or show something different than what's going on in the clinical trials, to provide more external validation to this. And so this is how I view observational research as an important complement to clinical trials. There's no randomization there, but there's a possibility to at least corroborate that information, and that's something we've done with the registries as well.
I would like to underline, we just need to listen as an important thing. I'm a 71-year-old person. I've had 2 stents, 2 bypasses, aortic replacement, and a valve replacement. When I was 18 years old, I lived in the country, and to get a job, I had to have it, and they told me I had a genital valve, noisy valve. Now, at 18, I then knew that one day, eventually, I would have to have it repaired, and I had it done 10 years ago. Now, so listening is a key factor. One, I lived in the country and the doctors had time to listen to me, where nowadays, you have a short session or a fast session, so it has to be fast. We don't have time to just listen to people. Males are our own worst enemy, and we don't tend to talk to it. Most men go to doctors because their wife says you need to go and see the doctor, and we tend to put up with things. So somehow you have to work smarter, and in anything, I've just seen my cardiologist. He says, how's your anginine? And I said, well, I haven't got it. And I said, well, but then I haven't got it. I've got the scripts, but I've never filled it and stuff. So you've got to ask some tricky questions to realise, am I really genuinely? If I had chest pain, I would be getting the anginine. So that's what I'm saying. I think the earlier you get, the people listen, the doctors listen, and feel free, particularly males, to put things out and not be macho and stuff. And things have changed nowadays, and I think that's a lot easier than when I was younger. We'd sort of stiff up a lip and stuff like that. So I commend you, and yeah, I knew I wanted to live a long time when I was 18. So I had to look after my health. I had to look after a thing. I went to the doctor and says, now it's time for me to have the heart replaced, because I couldn't walk up the hill. Keep the work going, and it's great to have it. I had the surgery. I was home within a week, and where years ago that would never ever happen. Thank you.
Well, I think this is where the tools you're talking about, Dr. Spertus, are so important. Having a consistent way to ask patients in a way that could be administered even before a visit, acknowledging the the demands on time for physicians and other clinicians that are seeing patients, being able to have a standard assessment of symptoms, quality of life, functional status, and have that available to you. And although you of course treasure the interaction with the patient, you don't need to worry about that component of it. You have this more objective assessment of it as well.
Or better yet, what it does, I think, is it allows, so if somebody is doing worse, before the doctor walks to the room, they realize my top priority here has to be figuring out what has changed in this person, versus if they're doing much better or they're unchanged and they still don't have any symptoms, then you could think about focusing that amount of time on other aspects. And we're very early in this field. We're going to learn an awful lot as we start integrating and getting more and more experience. But we think it'll be very empowering for patients. And when people have studied this, patients. So at the University of Utah, they rolled this out and they did a bunch of qualitative interviews with patients, because a lot of people would say, oh, patients don't want to fill out another form, blah, blah, blah. The patients actually really liked it. They thought it helped them prepare for the visit. It allowed them to really focus on how they were doing. But if their doctors didn't talk with them about their results, they were upset. And I learned a lot from that experience. And so as we roll this out and try and figure out how to integrate it, the larger challenge is teaching the doctors how to understand what these scores mean and what to do with them. And it doesn't take long. I mean, after 10 patients, doctors start getting a very quick intuitive sense, but getting them humble and willing enough to try it first. It's like the Life cereal ads in the 70s, getting Mikey to actually try Life cereal, and he tries it, he likes it. That's what we need to start moving to, is figuring out a way to introduce this into practice and allowing people to sort of figure out how best to integrate this. And similarly, you have a good relationship with your cardiologist, but if you were still where you grew up in a more rural area and your GP, you might be suffering for a long time before you ever got to see a cardiologist. If there was a way to sort of understand at a population level how people are doing and to identify those that are very symptomatic in the hopes of proactively reaching out to see a specialist, that also seems to me to be an enormously powerful opportunity to improve the care we give to the whole country.
You're right. I saw my cardiologist. I walked in well prepared, because I then became an authority on my condition, because I wanted to live. You've got to do that. I walked in, I said, I do a park run, I do it from this time, my weight's like this, and he's sitting there and he's taking his good feed, because it's what you're doing the right thing. So you're making, as a doctor, you're making your job easier, because you convince them that there is a possibility to do the right thing.
Yeah, I think you said it's really important. What you said is really important, which is you're the clearest authority on you, right? And having the information, being able to translate that into action, knowing how you feel, being able to present to you evidence of different approaches to therapy is really the key.
Yes. Yeah. Well, and that's what we're both, I think, really trying to push for.
Just in the interest of time, we'll wrap it up here. So if everyone can join me in thanking Professor John Spertus and Professor Frederick Masudi for their fantastic talks tonight. I also want to thank all of you who came to join us tonight and to listen to the two fantastic speakers. I just wanted to remind everyone to make sure you sign up for our mailing list so that you can get the information on future Research Tuesdays. And also, just in a moment, I'll put up on the screen a QR code. And if you scan the QR code, you can provide us for some feedback for these Research Tuesday events. So thanks so much for coming.